like to thank Fred for his introduction and you for coming along today to join me in a project which is occasioned by a couple of factors. One is that members of the Institute over the years have wondered about the possibility of setting up a series in which we deal with the development of Christianity from historical perspectives. And the other is, I was approached a year and a half ago by a publisher in London about the idea of explaining in a single volume what the basic elements of Christianity are. And in the course of my correspondence with him, I explained that to talk about how the moving parts work together, you really do need to explain how each emerged over time and then related to the others. So I'm bringing these two tasks together. The one, the establishment of historical perspective, and the other, to explain key elements of Christianity which have proven to be durable over the years. For that reason, in this first discussion, what I mean to do is to explain what it means to study Christianity as a religion over time, and then on that basis to be able to see its emergence in particular. We'll only be able today to do the start of its emergence. We will get into some of the major elements that Jesus directly contributed to the faith, but then we'll have to continue the story of Christianity's emergence over time. The most obvious element of Christianity is the fact of its focus on Christ, a Greek term applied to Jesus that treated him as especially chosen, as anointed, Christos in Greek. But Jesus is anointed in what sense? Is he chosen with the same meaning that the king of Israel was chosen? The Israelite king was also anointed and so called Mashiach in Hebrew. And some of Jesus' followers during his time viewed him as chosen in exactly that messianic sense. But others called him prophet. Most people called him teacher, using the title Rabbi. Son of God is another designation, and obviously raises the issue of Jesus' birth. Even as that title has proven mysterious, namely Son of God, we also find Son of Man used, and that by Jesus himself. How Jesus was identified, by himself, by his followers, and by those outside his movement, is a fascinating question. And during the course of our discussions, we will see each of these identifications as they were deployed in their original contexts. But the fact is that Christian believers, then and now, have not practiced their faith by waking up every morning and asking themselves, what title shall I apply to Jesus? Nor, for the most part, do they engage in Christological debates about the nature of Jesus. Yes, some of us do that, but let's face it, we're kind of odd. And for that reason, trying to explain Christianity as if it were just the story of how you talk about Jesus is far too limiting. Rather, believers in every age have met the challenges of their time and developed their hopes by seeing Jesus within the whole tapestry of their faith, relating him to themselves and to God at the same time. Understanding the basics of Christianity means seeing how the religion unfolded, producing prayers and creeds, services of worship, doctrines, and social movements that have proven enduring. As in the case of other religions, and here we come to the first item on the handout, As in the case of other religions, Christianity relates three kinds of human activity to one another. That's what makes Christianity a religion. And in fact, that is in the nature of any religion that I've ever studied. That it relates these two factors together, ritual, ethics, and meaning, in such a way that not only is one connected to the other, but a change in one reliably produces a change in the other. That is why religions are powerful social and historical forces. They combine social relations that can exist independently, but put them together into a mutually reinforcing system. What are these elements, and how are they related? Religions most visibly involve ritual activity. That is usually how we tell one from another. It can be as obvious as the shape of a house of worship. You will not see many mosques that look like the Church of St. John the Evangelist. You can tell just looking at it what it is designed for and how it fits within social activity. Ritual is a set of actions in which others participate and in which each player in the action understands the role to be played and the sequence of acts to be followed. Rituals in general are a very common part of social experience. They are certainly not limited to religious occasions. They might be obvious at the level of the small scale of an elementary school graduation, which I can assure you is a ritual activity. I have many, many younger sisters as well as children. Or at the national level of the inauguration of the president. Everyone seeing it understands the nature of the action, and in those cases, ritual is rather fixed and unrelated to other kinds of activity. That's one of the reasons they're amusing. But in the case of religion, the ritual is related to other activities, and that necessarily. Apart from rituals with others, religions are also concerned with how one should behave, whether in public or in private. Issues such as who can marry whom, what professions are acceptable, and when the responsibilities of an adult need to be taken up are all ethical concerns that religions typically address. One kind of activity can influence the other. A rite of passage at puberty, for example, might mark the moment that a child is viewed as an adult, so that the relationship between ritual and ethical activity is obvious. But in addition to these two, religions also and routinely involve a third dimension of activity. They tell their participants why they do what they do, sometimes even why they exist. Now, of course, you can pursue that question independently in a philosophical vein, and just as ritual on its own and ethics on its own might be pursued, so can philosophy on its own. There's a place down the street that would allow you to do that for credit. But in the case of religion, that philosophical pursuit has both ethical and ritual results, that necessarily. Precisely when an adult becomes an adult, for example, is a determination made on philosophical grounds differently in different cultures, and Christianity over time has developed different answers to that question, with coordinating and ritual adjustments. In the time of Jesus, you were of marriageable age when you were 13. That is no longer the case in most Christian cultures. So we need to trace how ritual, ethics, and meaning have produced the basic features of Christianity in their time in a way that not only says what a given item is, for example, a creed, say, but also why it emerged when it did and how it influenced the religion as a whole. So historical development forms an important aspect of what we'll be doing because Christianity has changed over time. By paying attention to how ritual, ethics, and meaning interact, developing understanding of both differences and continuity, then we begin to have a grasp of the Christian tradition. So that is one sense in which history just has to be a part of our work. But there's another reason for that as well, which is more subtle and also more fundamental. Christianity did not simply emerge out of one person's contribution. Not even Jesus is solely responsible for Christianity. You actually cannot blame him for everything. But then it's also the case that you can't assign the origin of Christianity to Paul, with some clever colleagues of mine at Oxford University like to say from time to time. But then they would say that kind of thing at Oxford. He also is in no reasonable sense the inventor of Christianity, although we'll see in due course that he's an important contributor to it. And the reason for which there is no single inventor of Christianity is not only that no one from the very beginning put the whole system together, but also that the system was not invented in a vacuum by one person. Quite clearly, the earliest framers of Christianity consciously engaged with the Judaism of their time. It was in that engagement that they changed the religious system they inherited, and they did eventually fashion a new religion. As it turns out, one of the most influential human history has seen. So for that reason, when we look at questions of origin, we need to deal with the basic system of Judaism in the first century and how the events of that time, the vision of Jesus, the thought of Paul, and the contributions of others produced what practitioners of the new faith and casual observers and enemies all regarded as a new religion. That earliest phase of Christianity unfolded during a period of persecution in the Roman Empire, precisely because the system was new. Roman authorities saw this faith as being what they called a superstition, that is, a recent innovation. We would say today a cult, rather than an ancient tradition. Because Christianity, in its earliest period, was a persecuted cult, as people called it, the shift into the next period, when Christianity, after Constantine in the 4th century, find itself at the center of power in a political machine that once rejected it, that was a period of radical transition. Nonetheless, during that transition, the Church laid down some of the classic foundations of its thought, as well as practice and ritual, that remain to this day. So I will be concerned principally this spring with the issue of the emergence of Christianity, first of all, and then, with a little bit of luck, with its transition into power during the 4th century. The point at which I treat of one topic or another depends on our rate of progress. But you can see that my intention is to set out an itinerary that will probably take us beyond this Lent and into next year as well, so that we can have a good sense of the unfolding of the Christian tradition as a whole. So let me turn to the issue of how we apply the understanding of religion that I just laid out to Judaism in the first century of the Common Era. That's that second entry on your sheet. As you can see, I've referred to it as being Second Temple Judaism, which is the usual scholarly designation. It is referring, that is, to what happened in Judaism after the time of the Babylonian captivity, when the Second Temple was restored on the place of the Temple of Solomon that had been destroyed by the Babylonians. By the time of Jesus, this temple had been the focus of extraordinary development. Herod the Great, who wasn't called great because of his toleration or his sensitivity to human rights or for the harmony of his family, but for his true magnificence as a builder, dedicated himself to the restoration of the temple. If you visit Jerusalem today or see a photograph of the Temple Mount, you will see the two major Muslim installations, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, apparently small as compared to an enormous stone plinth of approximately 35 acres. That was built by Herod the Great. And on top of that, he constructed the sanctuary, the interior courts, the mammoth altar for the purposes of sacrifice, the stone pillars on the north side of the altar for the purpose of trussing up animals prior to their being slaughtered. The temple in Jerusalem was the greatest enclosed temple of its time, and it drew people in from all over the world simply to see it. Now, the reason for that magnificence was not simply to produce a tourist attraction. The temple and sacrifice there was understood to be the emblematic Jewish ritual. It was the only place on earth where, according to the Torah, you were allowed to sacrifice. So if you wanted to fulfill your obligations, and you were a Jew living, let's say, in Corinth or Ephesus, you would try during the course of your lifetime to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to do what people living there would be able to accomplish far more readily. Because the understanding was that this ritual gave to the Torah its focus. And the Torah, as you can see, the second element here, represented the ethics of all Israel. Full ethics, including what we would call moral activity, together with activities that are related to what is considered pure enough to be able to offer in sacrifice. The idea of cultic purity and moral purity were bound together within the Torah. You would no more consider eating an unclean animal than you would consider robbing from your neighbor if you followed the Torah. Because, you see, ritual and ethics are indeed coordinated with one another. And they're coordinated in their meaning because of the most basic prophecy of all of Judaism, which was understood very clearly right the way through this Second Temple period. The most basic prophecy was given to Abraham when he left his native land in Ur of the Chaldees, was promised a new land, and told that after he settled there, all the nations of the world will be blessed in you. That is, when Israel keeps the Torah, when Israel engages properly in sacrifice, that releases a blessing which is to be inclusive of all nations. Now, within this consensus of Judaism, within this very broad system, there was, of course, controversy. Which part of the system should you really begin with? Do you look at this more from the point of the priesthood, in which case what you should focus on is getting sacrifice absolutely right inside the temple? Or should you look at it from the point of view of the Torah, as the Pharisees did, who said, you have to keep not only the Torah of Moses as written down, you also have to keep the Torah of Moses as it exists in the oral memory of what Moses said. And if you asked the Pharisees, well, how do I get the oral memory of what Moses said? They would say, just ask me, I'll tell you. It's within their chain of oral tradition. And lastly, there were those who were impatient for the fulfillment of what was taken to be a universal promise, and who said the obstacle right now to the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham is the Romans, and therefore we should take up arms against the Romans and resist them with all our might. Priests, Pharisees, and what I call prophetic nationalists were at odds with one another right the way through the first century. So into this time of peace and tranquility, Jesus was born in Galilee and grew up, and comes to be acknowledged locally at first, then more widely as a healer, as someone who can deal with what he called unclean spirits, and who emblematically taught his disciples how to pray. I actually gave you credit and didn't put the Lord's Prayer on the sheet, because it's what we all know. It is the most basic of elements within Christianity. But the point of my approach is that you can see why it is that that apparently simple prayer represents a shift in the system of religion in which Jesus was brought up. That's under Jesus 1. It follows ineluctably that there will be a Jesus 2. Jesus also, at the beginning of his life, acknowledges the centrality of sacrifice in the temple. We find him in the temple from time to time, and Luke's gospel presents him as being there from the period of his youth. But when we come to the basic meaning by which Israelites are to act, what we see in the Lord's Prayer is that Jesus is introducing a change for his followers to understand. And that is that they are to address God as being Abba, as being Father. So instead of the understanding that there will come a time when God would embrace both Israel and others, Jesus teaches his followers that they can individually and collectively acknowledge God as being present as Father to them just now. Now, this word Father by itself, as applied to God, is not completely innovative. I have to say that owing to an unfortunate error that happened during the 1950s. Not the only error of the 1950s, perhaps not the most important, but an error nonetheless. Writing a book on the parables, a German scholar named Joachim Jeremias wrote in some haste and perhaps too much enthusiasm that Jesus was the first person who ever called God Father, because he's never called that in Judaism. This would be kind of puzzling if it were true, but don't worry, it's just not true. And in fact, Jeremias realized he was wrong. God is called Father in the book of Isaiah, the book of Psalms, as well as in Judaic liturgy. And so he corrected that in the second edition of his book on the parables and actually apologized for his error. Don't you know, when the book was translated into English, it was translated on the basis of the first edition, and the mistake has been with us ever since. Generations of people in seminaries have been told something which is manifestly false. Also probably not the only example of that, but nonetheless a very clear example of that. What Jesus is doing that's innovative is not inventing some new language from God. I mean, let's face it, at this time in his life, he's an illiterate Galilean rabbi. He is not out to invent a new religion consciously. But his immediate sense is we do not begin with the thought that there will be a promise fulfilled. We begin with an understanding of fulfillment. We begin with the sense of our relationship to God as child to parent. Now, that doesn't mean we get rid of prophecy, because as you see, the other shift that Jesus makes is that in the place of Torah regulating the ethics of Israel, Jesus expects that his followers are going to act as those who are in the process of fulfilling prophecy. That's why he says to them, when they gather together for meals with one another, many shall come from east and west and recline at table. In those days, you didn't sit on a chair. This is a pre-Puritan environment. People recline at feasts and recline in the kingdom of God. In other words, he saw what was going on as being more inclusive than what the Pharisees were saying, which resulted in his disputes with the Pharisees, and also as not being limited to the temple, which put a cloud on the horizon in regard to his relationship to the priests. Because God was understood as Father, it also meant that his children had prophetic powers to determine their own behavior. Torah has just been put in a different and secondary position. That's a major shift. So although in this early Galilean period, Jesus is not consciously preaching a religious revolution, he has just created one. This position in which Torah no longer stands by itself, but instead has to serve the ethics of prophecy, brings about, over the course of time, a series of controversies that result in the awareness that, in fact, his followers are pursuing a different understanding of what religion is. Now, I already mentioned Jesus' mealtime practice with his followers of drawing together with them and commonly acknowledging the presence of God and the obligations of the kingdom of God. This is what leads me to Jesus' Mark 2, that happens as a result of his final visit to Jerusalem, which you might consider in particular during this time of the year. Because it is during this period that Jesus enters into direct controversy, not only with the Pharisees. Anyone could get away disputing with the Pharisees. They disputed with one another. But Jesus enters into a direct dispute with the priests in the temple, and particularly the high priest Caiaphas. to the point that he insists, as he quotes prophetic testimony, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have turned it into a den of thieves." He objects to the practice of commerce inside the temple, to the point that forcibly, with his disciples, he actually removes the animals, those who were buying, those who were selling, and releases the animals, the birds that might also have been offered. It is this direct dispute that results most immediately in his crucifixion. And in the midst of that dispute, he says to the people he is eating with once again, as he had been since his time in Galilee, as he offers them wine, "This is my blood." And as he breaks bread, he says, "This is my flesh." The act of mealtime fellowship has become the sacrifice. Because Jesus disputed with the priests in the temple to the point that he held that their worship was not in accord with prophetic principle, he announced to his disciples that their meal took the place of sacrifice in the temple. When he was found guilty of blasphemy by that same high priesthood, they were not crazy. They understood clearly that Jesus represented not simply someone who was arguing about a particular arrangement in the temple, but a prophet who was insisting that the very nature of sacrifice had altered. In effect, when they found him guilty of blasphemy, they were announcing the existence of a new religious system before most people in the world came to understand that. How it is that that system actually moved out into the open, well, we'll have to see next week. Thank you very much indeed. We usually take questions and comments at this time, and Faith can't wait, so we'll go to Faith first.
Thank you. You know, the way you just said it, it made it sound, we're so brainwashed into thinking that the Last Supper was the very first time he said that. This is my body, this is my blood. And you're making it sound like you've done that for months.
Well, let me, I have to repeat the question for the Cardinal of Red Hook. Yes. The question emerges of how should we see the Last Supper in relation to Jesus' mealtime practice with his disciples. One of the difficulties of the Last Supper is that one can frequently imagine that he just didn't eat anything until he was finally in Jerusalem. But the fact is, if you consider any of the Gospels, one of the principal places where Jesus taught was in the context of a meal. And his willingness to have at that meal people whom the Pharisees disagreed with and disapproved of resulted in controversy. He was happy to eat with sinners and, believe it or not, tax collectors. He believed that it was possible for them to be considered pure. Why? If you could pray that God was your Father and that his name was sanctified, which is what it means when we say hallowed, that's a sanctifying power. That purifies the person who prays in that manner. Now, at that point, Jesus is not saying, this is my blood, this is my body. At that point, they're having lunch. And they're having their meal in a context in which they see what they're doing as being a kind of down payment on a feast that God will provide for all peoples in the future. But in Jerusalem, the situation changes. There, Jesus continues his mealtime fellowship as before, It is primarily understood as a meal that celebrates the kingdom of God now, even as it gathers force and can become more visible. But the difference is, in Jerusalem, and I would say that this happened over a number of weeks, because it takes a while to teach a disciple, especially in the case of Peter. It takes a very long time to teach a disciple. Over several weeks, he begins to say, when we share in wine and bread in order to acknowledge the kingdom of God, that becomes our sacrifice. Now, I don't believe he said that prior to his dispute in the temple. Again, I don't believe that Jesus set out to found a new religion. I also think that it's inaccurate to say that Jesus was a religious reformer. Again, my same colleague at Oxford says that. I think it's just wrong, because a reformer is someone who has studied a system, who has a strategy, who plans it out and moves. I don't think Jesus intended to do that. It was rather that in this struggle to understand what true sacrifice was, he disputed with Caiaphas and the high priests and came to the conclusion, if I have to worship in that temple, which is really governed by commerce, not by prophecy, that's not acceptable. And God would prefer the sacrifice of the mealtime fellowship. That represents divine presence, rather than what is going on under the aegis of Caiaphas. So that's the reason I have two vital phases within the ministry of Jesus, each of which has contributed an enduring element of Christianity. The one hand, the Lord's Prayer, with its acknowledgement of Jesus as Father on behalf of all of those who pray it. It's not the nation, it's not the collective, it's the individual. And the second element, the insistence that the fellowship meal is the actual sacrifice that God prefers. Both of those would turn out to have explosive consequences. Yes, please, Lisa.
As a Jewish person, I've always been fascinated to hear other Jews say that Jewish continuity was really dependent on the destruction of the temple, in that we were forced to go into exile and therefore create synagogues and rituals that represented the sacrifice. And it occurs to me, is it possible Jesus in some way intuitively shared that viewpoint? That Jewish culture would not be able to continue if it weren't for the destruction of that temple and those rituals that would ensue as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. This is an extremely incisive question, namely, does Jesus have an intuition that what once happened in the past is actually showing you something about the nature of sacrifice? The first temple, after all, was destroyed in 586 before the Common Era. And the result of that was the exile. Did that mean the destruction of Judaism? No, it meant the addition of the Bible. The Bible as we know it, all right, not some books. The book of Daniel was not written until some time later. But the Bible as we know it, containing the Torah and the prophets and most of the writings, actually came into existence as a result of the destruction of the first temple. Because facing the prospect of extinction, prophets and priests did what they never did before. They worked together. Would that we could do this with Congress. I don't know. Send them to Babylon. Something good might happen. But the prophets and the priests together. Priests mostly interested in the Torah, prophets mostly interested in the prophets, actually frame the canon of the Hebrew Bible as we would know it. And one of their number, namely Ezekiel, who was both a priest and a prophet, had the visions which brought about the decision to return to the temple and to rebuild, to make the second temple. Ezekiel's visions are detailed to the point that there were those in Judaism, and this is very much the root of what's called the Kabbalah, of the mystical teaching within Judaism. There were those within the system who believed the true temple is not on the ground. The true temple is in the world of vision. And for that reason, there were also groups within the first century, the Essenes, who held, because the temple on the ground was imperfect and wasn't being run correctly, we really have to worship in such a way that we can join in the worship of heaven. So I think what you're saying has a great deal of merit, that Jesus is actually joining in a visionary tradition, which is so strong that it's willing to say, we can trump the temple we can see with the temple that you can't see, the temple that's in heaven. It also means that when that temple is destroyed again in 70, things are going to happen. But again, that's for next week. But I do think, actually, the destruction of the temple is one of the most pivotal moments. It's obviously so for Judaism, and I'll talk a little bit next time about how Judaism reacted, because it goes through a system change, has to. You know, if you think your ritual principle is right there in that place, and that place is gone, and the Romans tell you, as they did in 135, you can't ever go back there, that's going to bring about an alteration of the system. So definitely it's important for Judaism, but I'll argue it's also vital for Christianity, that something happened to compensate in Christianity without which we probably would not call it Christianity. You see, if we simply had the elements I referred to today, we would probably see this as being an interesting and perhaps aberrant form of Judaism, but I think that we would see it as so closely related that we would pause before saying it's a separate religion. After next week, I hope you will not pause, but you will see it as a separate religion, because by the end of the first century, it was correctly perceived by the faithful themselves, by Jews, and even by Roman authorities, that something new was going on here. Yes, please.
This may be a little off the subject, but it relates to it, and I hope my mind is coming in. What is a priest? What is a rabbi?
Mm-hmm.
Are they not the same?
Excellent question. What is a priest? Aren't I good today, Fred? It's not bad, right? What is a priest? What is a rabbi? Are they not the same? In brief, no, they're not the same. They really are totally different. That is that a priest, a Kohen, is someone whose job is, in Hebrew, to slaughter animals for ritual purposes. That's the whole gig. Your purpose is to go to the temple, to kill the animal, slit its throat, bleed it out, butcher it, bring it in so it can be properly laid on the altar, and the blood poured out with other offerings. You also have wine going in there and grain. This was a huge operation. You know, at times when there was a major feast, literally thousands of animals would be offered. The fire never went out. Once it was made, it would result in something that during the nighttime looked like a pillar of fire, because you had smoke up with all the light from the fire, and then during the daytime it looked like a pillar of cloud. So the picture you have in the Torah, in the book of Numbers, of Moses being led across the wilderness by a pillar of fire by night, a pillar of cloud by day, that imagery comes from the temple in Jerusalem. It's looking ahead. So a Kohen, and you can only be a Kohen because you're born to be a Kohen. That's the way it happens. You belong to the right genealogical group. There's no seminary for Kohanim. And most of them, to be frank, are on the dim side because, you're a butcher. I mean, I'm nothing against butchers, but there's no requirement of literacy because most of what you know as a result of an oral tradition. A rabbi, on the other hand, is so called because rabbi in Hebrew simply means one who is great, my great one. It's a bit like Mahatma. Right? You're acknowledging someone as a teacher whose authority is greater than yours. And in the first century, just as there's no seminary for priests, so there's no seminary for rabbis. Later, yes, there will be. Later, there will be such a thing as ordination to be a rabbi. That's after the destruction of the temple. While the temple stood, rabbi is an informal term. That's why Jesus is called rabbi in the Gospels more than he's called any other title. More than he's called Son of God, Son of Man, Messiah, Prophet, he's called rabbi. Because that's what you would call him if you were his disciple. It's what you would call him if you were skeptical of him but thought he might have a point. It's what you would call him even if you disagreed with him. Why does your teacher say that you don't have to wash hands before meals? In Aramaic, you would say, why does your rabbi say that? Doesn't mean you agree with him, but it means you know what kind of social function he has. So the rabbi really has a social function of a teacher, and it's quite unlike the function of a priest. We in English have suffered from a linguistic happenstance that has confused the matter. Because within the English language, when you want to refer to someone who is a teacher in the Christian tradition, you usually refer to that person as being a presbyter, from the Greek term presbyteros, which simply means elder, an elder in the community. This term got shortened down in English to the word priest. So a priest in English is really not someone that slaughters things. I don't do anything secret back there that relates to that at all. It just never occurs. But when English translators wanted to render the term in Hebrew Kohen, or in Greek hierus, which specifically refers to this function of slaughtering animals and sacrificing them, not actually having a word in English, they use the word priest for that too. So our language just happens to have encouraged that interesting confusion. So it's important to settle it. Yes, please, Bob.
Speaking as a Cohen, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you for leaving your apron at home.
Well, I will swab, and maybe we can check out the DNA. You mentioned that Jesus is not really a reformer, perhaps not a revolutionary, but I'm wondering if Jesus might be framed as an anarchist, because I'm reading now about Haymarket and the anarchists in the 1880s in Chicago. The belief, he seems to be against the structure of Judaism, the temple, the very building, and its leaders, and is saying we can have our community, what you described as meals, is a community thing. We don't need to do it in a structure. Isn't that a kind of anarchism?
It's a wonderful question. Should we see Jesus as an anarchist? What I would suggest is that when we come to that second stage, where he is in opposition to the priesthood in Jerusalem and occupying the temple. And that's what he's doing. He's going in there with his disciples. He's stopping the operation. According to Mark, Jesus did not permit anyone to carry a vessel through the temple, which means you're stopping it. I mean, imagine you will go into the stock exchange and you say, you know, I don't like the way the 1% are governing this, so I am going to stop it. You know, some of my colleagues say, oh, what Jesus did in the temple was symbolic. And my response is, yes, it was symbolic, but do you really understand the importance of symbolism? Because if you prevent sacrifice, that, to those who are participants, is more than a symbolic gesture. That's a direct threat to your existence. You look indeed like an anarchist, like someone who is simply upsetting the whole principle of the order of that society. And for Judaism of the first century, the temple represented that principle. And it also did, and this is why Jesus wound up crucified and not executed by another means, it also did for the Romans. Because the Romans protected the temple, the Romans paid for sacrifice in the temple twice a day. Why did they do that? Most of their subjects, the Romans compelled to offer to the gods of Rome. You know, if you had a civic occasion, I could compel the people of a given city to make sure that they offered their ox to the Pantheon in Rome, and in particular, I could demand that you offer allegiance to the emperor as being God's son. And for that purpose, you would have to burn some incense in front of him and pour out some wine.
You mean they lease the facility twice a day?
Twice a day, they leased the facility. Exactly. Instead of saying to the Jews, they couldn't say to the Jews, you're going to engage in this pagan sacrifice, because they understood that they would have revolution on their hands. And the Romans, while they were still a republic, had entered into an alliance with the Jewish state. So they couldn't just say, no more Judaism. So instead they said, you will not have to offer sacrifice to our gods, but we will pay for sacrifice in your temple, and when that happens, you are basically praying for us, not to us. So if you interrupt the sacrifices in the temple, that's a challenge to Rome as well as a challenge to Judaism as such. When what was called the Jewish War broke out, the moment was understood by the Senate in Rome when the revolutionaries, who had been engaged in violence since the year 63, there had been mounting campaigns against the Roman governors in Jerusalem and Caesarea Maritima. But in the year 66, the leadership in the temple said, we will no longer accept any offering from a Gentile. That meant the emperor. And when they made that announcement, the Senate sent the 10th Legion Fretensis, and they carved the whole area up. It was an amazingly successful and bloody military assault. So if you interfere with the temple, you are interfering with Judaism, and you're interfering with Rome. There was another question, someone just ahead of Bob, and I could, sorry, yeah?
It's in tandem with this man's question, I guess, by implication. What I was feeling is that the transition that you point out from the collective to the individual seems to me earth-shaking. So it's hard to imagine that Jesus wouldn't have felt like something of an outlier.
This is an excellent question. Would Jesus have felt like an outlier when he prayed in the way that he did? My response would be no more than he had felt earlier. Because where is he born? He's born in Galilee, which during this time is known as Galilee of the nations, as the book of Isaiah refers to it. That's not a compliment. That is, that was a part of the ancient kingdom of David and Solomon, which had been taken over centuries before by the Assyrian Empire, and non-Jews had been settled there. So they were regarded by people in the south around Jerusalem as being a mixed race. Jesus himself, growing up in Nazareth, a very small agricultural hamlet of a couple of hundred people, had no advantages of education that he could boast. And although there were many different disputes about his birth, one thing was clear: no one could name Jesus' father. And if you couldn't name your father in the Judaism of this period, you were what was called a mamzer, a person of mixed race, and your ability to have contact with other Jews was limited as a result of that. So, you could imagine Jesus deliberately marginalizing himself by praying the way he did, or you could imagine that the fact that he had been marginalized caused him to look at God in a different way. That God was a point of sustenance that he grew to rely on when he could not guarantee that those around him would give him the kind of support which a conventional teacher might have been able to count on. Rosalie.
An interesting point, a symbolic one. The temple sacrifice is the sacrifice of animals. The Eucharist is the sacrifice of the fruits of the land, bread and wine. No mention of meat on the table. Interesting point.
Yes, that's right. You can certainly, and this is usually the case, you can certainly celebrate Eucharist without meat and without fish. On the other hand, most of Jesus' meals did not consist of unleavened bread. That is, the fact, and we'll get into at a really now much later stage, why the practice of Eucharist in most churches prescribes unleavened bread and why it's limited to wine and bread. But your point, I think, is very sound. It does not assume that it's going to be a better sacrifice because, let's say, you offer a bull.
What?
Bull.
Be less good sacrifice in my eyes.
You would not prefer that.
Sacrifice in the old tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I understand it.
The cardinal is giving me his signal, which means either that I should stop or that he's really annoyed with me. And I don't want to see what the next signal might be. But I'll be hanging on for any of you who would like to continue our discussion. Thanks very much for coming.